Asegu Swafigu, Sarah Smith Yungiats, Oniote Agane Okale Wagwaho Nuwagadaloda. Hello everyone, I'm Sarah Smith. I work as the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison with the College of Menominee Nation. And as Joe mentioned, I'm a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. And also a member of the Tribal Adaptation Menu team as one of the co-authors.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Matt Hudson. As Joe said, I work with the Burke Center at Northland College, which is in Ashland, Wisconsin, so the western part of Lake Superior. And I'm going to be talking a little bit today about a case study of applying the Tribal Adaptation Menu to a lake management planning project that we've been working on here in northern Wisconsin.
Bonjour, Robin Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe Philadelphia, and Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe and Dad, Cliffwick and Penokee. My name's Rob Croll. I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, a member of the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu author team, coming to you today from Odana, Wisconsin at Muskogee, the Bad River Indian Reservation up here on Lake Superior. Today, we're going to be talking to you about Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe Ezhitwaad, more commonly known as Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu. One thing you heard me just do is introduce myself in Ojibwe Moan, the language of the Ojibwe people. At Cliffwick, we work for 11 Ojibwe tribes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, helping them to implement and practice their off-reservation treaty rights on lands that they ceded to the United States back in the mid-1800s. One part of our mission here at Cliffwick is to integrate Ojibwe knowledge and culture into everything that we do, and we recognize that language is the foundation of culture. So just a brief aside about the title of the Climate Adaptation Menu. Throughout the project, the author team typically referred to it as the Tribal Adaptation Menu, or TAM, and you'll hear us use that acronym quite a bit today. But towards the end, when we're getting ready to publish, we knew we needed to go get appropriate titles in Ojibwe and hopefully in Menominee to reflect the work from that perspective. We went to an elder from one of the tribes that we work with here in Wisconsin, and the title that he gave us in Ojibwe Moan is Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe Ezhitwaad. It does not reflect anything about climate or climate adaptation, but the literal translation is doing a thing the Anishinaabe way. Anishinaabe has a couple meanings. One is a distinct group of tribes, including the Ojibwe. A deeper meaning there is also Anishinaabe refers to original man or first man. So this title really refers to going back and using some of that old knowledge and those old teachings to help us to adapt to climate change. And we recognized early on that there was a need for an adaptation planning tool for tribes that integrates their knowledge, culture, science, and perspectives with Western science, but also a need to facilitate culturally appropriate climate adaptation between tribes and their partners, because nobody works in a vacuum. The TAM was a very large project that had a large author team from multiple agencies. You can see all of our authors there in the circle, and that circle reflects that everybody's contribution was important. Some people in that circle may have contributed one sentence or one perspective to the menu, while others took a long time and spent a lot of time writing. And we did win the 2019 Climate Adaptation Leadership Award through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies for the menu. So adaptation menus, how do they work? So you see me standing here with my buddy Soren, who is the son of one of my colleagues here at Cliffwick. And we're talking about climate adaptation in a TAM workshop. And Soren's here because we remember that we're doing this work not for ourselves, but for future generations, for him and his kids, all the way through 7 generations ahead. So we're thinking about climate adaptation, and this part of the presentation was taken directly from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, who is one of our partners. Many of you may have worked with them. And you recognize that there's no real answer, no single answer to climate adaptation, because every landowner is different. Every steward is different. Every piece of land is different. All of our goals are different. And each decision is going to be unique, and it's going to vary based on people, place, purpose, and practice. So when NIACS began, their idea was to come up with this really comprehensive adaptation tool that was going to tell people how to adapt to climate change. And they quickly realized that that wasn't feasible. And so they adapted, and their goal is to help landowners and land managers adapt to climate change based on these factors of people, place, purpose, and practice, and not tell people how to decide, but to provide tools for them to make their own decisions based on their needs. One of these tools is a series of adaptation menus, and the menu format really helps decision makers choose actions that are right for them. So if we look at this menu here on the right side of the screen, I mean, if we really want to, we could have French toast, meatballs, and red wine and sangria as part of our meal, because that might be what's right for us. It also helps us to connect broad ideas to specific actions. So thinking about broad goals for your project, and then translating that down to on-the-ground adaptation tactics in a plan that you create. And it also helps you to communicate your ideas and boost your creativity. Adaptation menus are used as part of a formal decision-making process. And again, this is adapted right from the NIACS workbook. And they're used in step 4 of this process, where you're identifying your adaptation approaches after you've defined your objectives, assessing climate impacts to that land and water that you're working on, evaluating your goals in light of that assessment. And then the 5th step is monitoring and then reassessing. And as I said, NIACS has created a series of menus that fits your needs. So they're thinking about things like California forests, forest carbon management, inland glacial lake fisheries, which I think is probably important to this group. Our tribal adaptation menu fits in other tribal perspectives, wildlife management, whatever you happen to be into. And with that, I will turn it over to Sara to talk about the beginnings of our specific menu.
Thanks, Rob. The TAM beginnings really start back in 2017 when some folks from our menu author team went to one of the NIACS workshops. And at these workshops, you bring projects with you, and they brought a project regarding monomen or wild rice. And while they were going through the workshop, it was really helpful for their project, but there were some things missing. And that's what sparked this idea of a tribal adaptation menu. Next slide. There we go. Okay. So thinking about climate change and how it affects tribes. And tribes are really one of the frontline communities when it comes to climate change. And the reason why is because tribes are really dependent on our non-human relatives to meet a lot of our needs, including spiritual, ceremonial, medicinal, subsistence, and economic. And when we're thinking about these relatives, so you'll hear this term brought up in the presentation. We like to think of them as relatives and not resources. But these are really important when thinking about climate change because they're impacting not just the landscape, but us as well. So thinking about relatives and not resources, a lot of the teachings come to, these beings or our relatives were on the land first. And so they are our teachers and our elders. And so with that, we need to really think about how we're going about our management practices and showing respect and recognition when we're doing our work. And so decisions for our relatives were originally communal decisions that were made with this acknowledgement throughout the process, whereas a lot of management today and decision making for the land and the resources as they're seen, that's no longer communal, and it's usually made by a few individuals or an agency or an institution, and not with the communities as well, and also with the talking to our relatives that we're going to be working with the management, whether that be wolves or fish or forests. And so with the spark of a tribal adaptation menu, it really came from what was needed was Indigenous perspectives. And so this calls for observation, recognizing and learning from our first teachers. So those beings on the landscape that were here before us, and adaptation that addresses responsibility and reciprocity to all our relations, not just our human relations, but our non-human. And Western perspectives, a lot of the time, emphasizes control and management of these non-sentient beings, which is a very different perspective from how tribal folks work. And so, for example, instead of waiting for systems to naturally establish themselves, managers are usually tasked with selecting specific management actions right away. So if a tornado comes through the landscape, a lot of managers need to are tasked with thinking quickly about, how are we going to reforest? How are we going to, reestablish the community there? And so the tribal adaptation menu offers a different perspective on adaptation planning. So, for example, a lot of our adaptation menu really based it on the forest adaptation menu. And so one example of how these two are very different is with these strategies. So in the forest adaptation menu, there's a strategy for preventing the introduction and establishment of invasive plant species and removing invasives. So one of the approaches that they have is eradicating existing populations or seed sources through physical and chemical treatments. Now, in the tribal adaptation menu, this is something we talked about a lot, just over the term invasive species and how it's seen through tribal lenses. And this was a conversation that we had, for a full day, just thinking about invasive species. And so what we came to, and I should mention too, that all of these strategies and approaches, everything in the menu is based on consensus. So if somebody wasn't feeling right about something, we would talk in depth about that until everybody agreed that this is what we should put in the menu. So in regards to invasive species, we have a strategy that says maintain or improve the ability of communities to balance the effects of non-local beings. And so one approach would be to remove existing non-local beings after communicating with the beings in the area to explain our intended actions. So as you can see, these are very different approaches to the same idea. It's just a very different perspective when working with the beings on the landscape. Another thing, as you'll see in the picture on the right, is our first three set of strategies really focuses on that cultural component. So the first strategy we have in there is to consider cultural practices and seeking spiritual guidance. So that includes things like contacting cultural leaders, tribal historic preservation officers, folks like wild rice gatherers, if that's the area you're working in, and also how to consider mindful practices of reciprocity when working with the tribes, and also the beings on the landscape and how to do that in a respectful manner. And so the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu is primarily developed for the use of indigenous communities, tribal natural resource agencies, and non-tribal partners as well. And so the hope of the TAM is to help bridge communication barriers between non-tribal partners and those interested in working with indigenous approaches to climate change, and how to incorporate the needs and values of those tribal communities that you're doing these projects on. And it's designed to be used across diverse ecosystems and scales, management contexts, values. And even though it's primarily written based in the Midwest, since that's where all of us authors are from, it's very adaptable, as I'll mention later on. So one thing that's really unique with the TAM is that it starts off with these guiding principles. So in the beginning of the TAM, we list out guiding principles as a sort of framework to integrate indigenous knowledge, and with that comes the culture, language, and history into the adaptation planning by providing guidelines or guiding principles for non-tribal partners working in indigenous communities. So this includes things like offering a SEMA or tobacco to the relatives we're working with on the landscape, to partners, and how to go about that in a respectful way in indigenous communities. Now this whole menu is written from an Ojibwe and Menominee perspective, but it is intentionally designed to allow other tribal communities to integrate their customs and culture and language into the menu. Because what might be respectful in one community, like offering tobacco, might be very different in another one, like in the Southwest. So it's very adaptable to be used in different communities. And it really focuses on empowering tribal communities in numerous ways, like restoring language and promoting tribal sovereignty. And so I'm just going to go over briefly some of the TAM strategies and approaches that we have in the menu. So like I mentioned in the beginning, the first three strategies really focus on cultural practices. So I touched on strategy 1 before. Strategy 3, supporting tribal engagement in the environment. And this can look really different depending on the project you're working on, who you're working with. So it could be establishing environmental education, youth groups, language revitalization programs, monitoring programs, things like that. And then there's also strategy 2, which is actually the last strategy we wrote in the menu. And it's learning through careful and respectful observations. So learning from the beings and the natural communities as they respond to changing conditions over time. So I mentioned this briefly in the beginning of my section on how a lot of managers are tasked with, you know, a management plan after an event happens, like a tornado or some other natural event. And we have the mentality is to, you know, we need to fix this, we need to get it back to the way it was. And this strategy allows for this natural response to changing conditions just through observations to see how the landscape is responding. And perhaps it's responding in a way that would be different from one of those quick management plans that managers are tasked with. So to date, we have had 5 workshops since January 2019. So our first workshop was over in Minnesota, and our last one was actually March of 2020, right before everything shut down. And these workshops are hosted by tribal communities. And that's really important when we're doing this work. And we also do have some planned upcoming, which I can mention a little bit later. And so Rob touched on this when he was talking about it. This is how we set up our workshops, is according to how NIAX has their workbook, which is really helpful. So the workshops in general are about 2.5 days. And so the first day, we really get into guiding principles and really, you know, grounding ourselves in where we are and into our goals and objectives. We get an intro to the TAM, going through all of it. And then we really focus on steps 1 through 3 here. So defining our management objectives, assessing our climate impacts, and then evaluating our management objectives. Throughout all this, it leads up to developing a poster. So day 2 is really identifying your adaptation approaches and putting this on a poster so we can share with each other's groups and get feedback on ideas that maybe those groups didn't think about. And then on our last day, we really touch on the monitoring and evaluating effectiveness. So what does success look like in your project? And then we do a wrap up. So overall, we've had 35 projects so far for using the Tribal Adaptation Menu. And like I said, the TAM itself is written based in the Midwest, but it is adaptable. So we've had projects from Oklahoma, Maine, Florida, all dealing with different issues. So for example, in Florida, their project was dealing with sea level rise, which, you know, isn't directly covered in the menu because we don't experience that here. But because it is so flexible, we were able to work with that, project and get it to work with the menu as well. So a lot of these projects bring different ideas. A lot are based in natural resources, but there are some that are outside the box. And with each workshop we've had, the projects are becoming more outside the box as well that we're seeing. So like education plans and all kinds of things. So I will throw it over to Matt to give you an example of the project he brought to the TAM workshop.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So yeah, our specific project here that I'm going to talk about maybe didn't entirely fit the TAM mold as it's kind of laid out initially by Sarah and Rob, but we found, you know, the TAM to be very flexible, as they're saying, and we're able to find some ways to apply it to our specific work here in what we call the Penokee Lakes. So this is a lake management planning project that we've been working on for a number of years here at Northland College. And so our specific work wasn't necessarily strictly climate adaptation driven, but I think the lake management planning framework that we were trying to work within, or maybe change slightly through this process, is something that might be kind of relevant to some of the folks that are part of the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership. So this photo here is an aerial image of at least 3 of the Penokee Lakes, and gives you a sense of the landscape that we're working in here. Is very forested, a lot of wetlands, a lot of intact watersheds, and really low levels of shoreline development in general within these lakes. Next slide, Rob. So just to set the geography a little bit better for you, these Penokee lakes are headwater drainage lakes for the Bad River, which ultimately flows north into Kichigami or Lake Superior through the Mashkasibi or the Bad River Reservation. And so the mouth of the Bad River at the Bad River Kakagan Sloughs is a Ramsar wetland of international importance, and a big part of the Ojibwe migration story coming to this area, to the place where the food grows on water. This is the Bad River Kakagan Sloughs has very large wild rice or manuman beds that are very important to the lifeways of the tribe. So you notice that inset map that I have on this page kind of shows a box about where we're located here, but also shows the boundaries of the different treaties that were signed by the Ojibwe tribes and the federal government back in the mid-1800s. So we're located with this project within the 1842 ceded territory. Let's go to the next slide, Rob. So here we're zooming in a little bit more on the specific area with the lakes that we're working on. You can see them. They all are hydrologically connected to the Bad River. The small village of Mellon is the largest community, I guess, in the area, less than 1,000 people. But you'll notice the Penokee Iron Range is shown there kind of in the middle of the slide. And this part of northern Wisconsin has, and extending into Michigan, one of the largest known but undeveloped taconite iron ore reserves in North America. And so this area was proposed for a large open pit taconite mine back around 2011. And so around that same time, there was a large effort by a number of natural resource agencies and groups, tribes, to try to figure out the best way to learn more about both the terrestrial and aquatic resources in this region, which really hadn't received a lot of study previously because this area is largely undeveloped. So at the Burke Center at Northland College, we were already doing some lake management planning work with other lakes in the region, and we were in a good position to do some studies of the lakes in the region. So we proposed to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to study these lakes in using a series of Wisconsin DNR surface water planning grants, comprehensive planning grants. And so by using that mechanism, we kind of had to break the lakes up into studying them in 2-year chunks based on the funding mechanism. We were able to, starting in 2015, and then eventually all 11 lakes have been studied. And right now we're to the point where the final lake management plan is nearing completion, covering 2015 through 2020. Okay, so Rob, next slide. So I guess the reason, the linkage here to the TAM, the surface water grant program through the DNR oftentimes is you have lake associations around a given lake will work with a consultant or another group to apply for these grants, and then are often implemented by consultants or people like us. And there really isn't a great mechanism for you're supposed to be doing stakeholder outreach and engagement, and oftentimes that includes people that directly live around these lakes, as opposed to the broader community that actually utilizes these lakes in one way or another. And in the northern third of Wisconsin, and also, of course, parts of Michigan, Minnesota, many of the upper Midwest area is ceded territory areas where the tribes have reserved rights for hunting, fishing, and gathering on many of these water bodies. So really, there isn't, at least in my experience, been a really good mechanism for incorporating cultural uses and values as being one of the important things that needs to be identified as you're developing these plans. In addition to doing, the studies, the lake condition assessments, and then ultimately assembling the management plan goals and implementation strategies. So that's been very Western science focused in my, at least in the experience that I have working with these particular planning grants. So I was very pleased to see the announcement for the TAM workshop, the one in March of 2020, provided a great, I guess I should back up a little bit. When we assembled the stakeholder team, or the project team for this effort, we were very thoughtful about engaging both the Red Cliff and Bad River tribes, which are the tribes most local to this area, as well as GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. These were the natural resources agency folks that we've often worked with before. And so we were seeking a little bit better way to maybe reach out to the community more as a whole, to get some feedback about cultural uses and values with respect to these lakes, particularly given their location at the headwaters of the Bad River watershed. Okay, so next slide. Now, I'll be the first one to admit that, Sara mentioned how that adaptation menu training was right before the pandemic, led to a lot of shutdowns. And so the plan that we came out of that meeting with, and so our management planning process was one of the case studies at this March workshop, didn't necessarily get to materialize the way we had hoped they would, given the limitations we had with the pandemic. However, we were able to, I think, develop a deeper connection with some of the key people, particularly at the Bad River Tribe, the tribal chair and the historic preservation officer, some additional contacts that we didn't have, or at least as well, when we started this process. So, and we received a lot of guidance on, how do we start to incorporate some of these cultural uses and values into this plan? And our approach was a lot about just recognition of the different things that are, critical to the Ojibwe story, the migration story, how they ended up on in this area, the connection they have to the landscape, and of course the treaty reserved rights that they have to these particular water bodies, given that they're in the ceded territory. Recognizing that the Bad River Tribe has federally approved water quality standards that are directly downstream from these lakes, so the quality of the water flowing from these lakes ultimately will affect the quality of the water that's flowing onto the reservation and subject to the standards that the tribe has approved by the EPA. So a further recognition of the cultural uses and values of the lakes, and those aren't always known, or they aren't always fully established, but recognizing that those might be more than just, for instance, wild rice harvest or walleye harvest, which were two of the more readily apparent resources that would be of value to the tribes. But it goes much deeper than that, and doesn't necessarily, all these things aren't necessarily known. And so what it comes down to is healthy ecosystems are what end up supporting a lot of these lifeways. And I wanted to, the Ojibwe language, we tried to incorporate that into the plan where we could, using Ojibwe words for wild rice, for walleye, oga, manumin, and other things. And what we realized as we were developing the goals, the management plan goals for this project, is that, front and center is really where this sort of recognition belongs, where the tribal lifeways require the maintenance of healthy ecosystems in lakes and surrounding watersheds, in order for them to be able to meet their subsistence, economic, cultural, medicinal, and spiritual needs. So in order for those needs to be met, we need healthy ecosystems, and that really overlays with everything that we would be trying to do with this management plan that might go beyond just tribal interests. So that goal related to cultural uses and values is front and center with our plan. And then we've also worked it into many of the implementation strategies that we have within the plan as well. So I'm not going to say that we maybe utilize the TAM to its fullest potential, but I will say that it has been extremely beneficial to me and to us as we've thought about developing or incorporating the cultural uses and values into this plan. And I would hope this would be something that could be further infused into perhaps the lake management planning process in Wisconsin and other areas, because it was a really important, I guess, training tool and just a way to think about things a little bit differently that was really valuable to us as we worked through our process. All right, that's next slide. That's all I have, Rob.
At this time, I think we're about done. We'd like to say Miigwech Dibaginjigaadeg. Thank you for listening to us, and we're happy to answer questions now.
Matt, Sarah, and Rob, thank you so much. That's really interesting stuff. I've learned a lot. Having read the TAM already, I've learned a lot just hearing you walk through the process behind the creation and implementation and things that you've learned along the way. So thank you for sharing. And I think I speak on behalf of the participants and saying thank you. Normally we'd give a round of applause, but we can't do that in the virtual setting. You'll have to just put up with my applause. We do have the opportunity to ask these fine folks some questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please submit it through the question and answer function. Again, you can hover your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, and there's a little dialog box that pops up. It says Q&A. You can type your questions into there, and we'll get answers for you. I don't see any questions at the moment, but rest assured that I have plenty. Ooh, here we have one. So I'll go to the audience questions first. How does the TAM address invasive species when those species are seen as relatives? And the person asking this question acknowledges it's a pretty big question, but how you guys approach this question?
So that was actually kind of the focus of that day-long discussion. It's recognized, I think, kind of universally that no species exists in a vacuum, and that natural communities have grown up with checks and balances, so that no one species is going to take over. The other side of that coin is most of the non-local beings that cause problems in our ecosystems they didn't come here by themselves. They didn't come here according to their instructions from the creator. They were brought here by humans. So humans are directly responsible for the problem. But we need to recognize that even though these beings are causing a problem in the environment, they have agency. They have their instructions from the creator. They're just outside of their community, so they don't have their checks and balances. So we have to recognize that in some cases we can work with them. There may be potential uses for them, culturally, subsistence, medicinal, that maybe we don't know. So maybe we need to address that by talking to people where that being actually came from, and seeing how we can interact better with it. Maybe it is physical or chemical control, but trying to just practice that in a much more respectful way, I think, is really the idea.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's really an important point as we think about how we approach invasive species. The next question is, how did you approach working through different concerns of importance since there are so many stakeholders? You guys wrangled a really large and diverse group of stakeholders. So
Yeah, and so lots of different concerns, lots of different perspectives based on, our backgrounds. So like I mentioned, we started writing this in early 2017. We didn't get done with it until 2019. So it took us 2 years to write this. And, luckily this wasn't like grant directed, so we didn't have a specific time frame, which meant we could take our time with talking about all these different concerns and perspectives from folks. All of our meetings were in person for those who could make it, and they would be day-long sessions where we would talk about the different strategies and approaches and our differing viewpoints. But it took a lot of conversation. And I feel like sometimes that doesn't get to happen because, we get grants, we only have a year to do something. And so our timeline is hurried. I think with this, it was really, I'm really grateful we didn't have that restriction, because I think it would have turned out a lot differently if we were restricted to a timeline. So it was just a lot of conversation, making sure everybody's voices was heard, and making sure that those concerns were dealt with. So yeah, it was just a lot of work and a lot of conversation.
well, thank you. Thank you for putting in the work. Okay, I have a few questions. So, the document and the strategies it recommends has been kind of out there in the wild for a little bit now. And I'm curious what feedback you guys are getting as it's being implemented. Which of the objectives or strategies you're finding most used, what maybe are some things that you might change or might consider changing in the future, those sorts of things as it's being used.
I think one of the things that really surprised all of us on the team was how quickly it took off and how quickly there was interest in it from places we never even considered. Mexico, for example, Alaska, Canada, Africa. And one of the things that we really realized is that as it was developed using Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives, there's a lot of overlap in some of those bigger overarching themes, but there's definitely differences when it comes to cultural practices. And I think a lesson learned for me anyway is that, I was out in New Mexico earlier this year on the Pueblos, and I was talking to an elder, and I said, if I want to approach an elder here in Wisconsin where I work, I'll do that with a SEMA, with tobacco, and offer them kind of what I'm asking for and my intent, and then offer them tobacco and ask for their assistance. And she told me that out there, tobacco's fine, but coffee or canned goods, the food is actually better to show your respect and your intent that way. Another lesson learned was that our original menu focused really a lot on natural resources and particularly forestry, and we had no idea how many different people would want to use the menu for different things. When you have somebody trying to create an emergency management plan in one of your workshops for like hazardous material spills, that takes some thinking. So Sarah, anything to add?
No, I think you captured it. Yeah, I too was surprised on how quickly it took off. Even before we were published, because people knew we were working on it and they wanted to see what we were producing. So Yeah, I think just the quickness of it. Our author team looks really large, but because we get so many requests, there just aren't enough of us to fulfill all those requests. So that's something I wasn't expecting either, was just how many requests we were getting for workshops, for presentations, and that kind of stuff. So
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah. Got a few more questions coming in. Matt, you indicated some of the TAM didn't quite fit into your plan. What parts of the TAM were easiest to take advantage of?
I think for us, we already had some where we were at least trying to be intentional about interacting with the tribal communities in the area, and that was mainly happening through the natural resource agencies that we were working with at those tribes. So I think it was just the different perspectives that Rob and Sarah were talking about, different ways of looking at things, and trying to put a different lens on when you're talking about, okay, fish populations in these lakes, how can we best support the walleye recruitment in these lakes. And it provided just a different lens or way of looking at that. And I really appreciated the approach that was very kind of, you can adapt this menu to your needs and what you see as what's needed in your particular plan, whatever that might be. So it's called the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu, but with a lake management plan, it also made us think about, okay, maybe we're not doing enough related to climate adaptation either within this plan. So I think it was just really helpful in terms of critically thinking about what we were doing in a different way with a different lens on.
And sort of the flip side of that then is, what challenges did you have as you thought through implementing the watershed management planning process? What were some of the biggest challenges that you had in taking those differing tribal perspectives and helping them to be implemented? I think, for example, earlier Sarah talked about communicating with beings and learning from the beings, and I imagine that includes some combination of observation and sampling and those sorts of things. I don't know exactly, but I'm curious how you're able to marry those sorts of perspectives with the fairly regimented frameworks that sometimes come with these management plans.
Yeah, I think, again, we did get limited, I think, in what we had hoped to do by the pandemic, and not being able to communicate with the community members maybe the way we had hoped to. We did have some really great conversations with a select few people that were really helpful in how do we word this, how do we think about this, what might be, Rob had the example of the way of looking at non-local beings, and how do we maybe think about that in a different way. So in this case, I'm not sure I would have, or our team would have come up with the idea of the number one goal in the management plan being supporting the cultural uses and values of these lakes. It requires healthy ecosystems. Well, that's like, it almost seems like, well, duh, at this point, that's something that we should have thought of right away. But I think I felt like maybe I personally had blinders on a little bit more than I thought I did. And I appreciate the ability to, just talking with the people that we were able to talk with, and not everyone being unassuming too, and not, pushing something, and also not necessarily giving the answer, making us think about it too. I appreciate it. So I'm happy with what we've come up with so far. And I hope with our next iteration of the planning we do, that we can incorporate a little bit more of the community engagement that we'd hope to do. but didn't get to because of the pandemic.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Matt. Okay, next question. What are some other strategies that the TAM recommends for our relatives? The person says, I love that the document leads with the cultural considerations, and those are key and missed all the time in Western science, but wonder what other approaches we can consider when implementing this menu.
That's a big question. So throughout the TAM itself are all different recommendations for our relatives. Like Rob mentioned, this is mainly like a forest-based menu, because that's what we were basing it off of. But it does, so the first three are very considerate of including cultural knowledge and community, like the tribal communities and things like that. When you start reading through the document, you'll see the type of language we use in here. So like things like maintain and revitalize cultural approaches to harvesting and caretaking. And then talking about things like maintaining or improving the ability of communities to balance the effects of money dunsak. I think I said that right, Rob. I'm working on my Ojibwe here, which are little spirits. And so in each of these, we talk about like a brief description of what that means as well for those who, aren't involved with the language. So that means things like insects or pathogens. So how do we work with those in communities with showing respect as well? So I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of that throughout the menu once you start reading it. So things like, we talk about air pollution, herbivory, fragmentation, hydraulics, water stuff, hydrology, there we go. I don't know why I can't say that word today. Talking about things like cultural site disturbances. Yeah, what do you think, Rob?
So I think when you read through the menu, you'll see that there is a lot of Western science, for lack of a better term, in there. And we try to kind of integrate tribal cultural perspectives in right next to it. So thinking about things like, a long-term monitoring of a site might include, as Sara mentioned, kind of restoring cultural harvest there, because having people out there on the landscape and adding a kind of an education component to that harvest, you have people out there keeping an eye on things, and maybe are noticing things in a way that those of us working for an agency wouldn't necessarily do, or even people who are out recreationally hunting, fishing, or boating might not do.
Yeah, and you mentioned the long term, and it reminds me of what I believe it was Sara said earlier about thinking about 7 generations, into the future. That's an important perspective for at least some of us. I know in my own work, it's difficult to think a year or 2 years out sometimes, and it can be a little overwhelming. But having that really long perspective and thinking about those future generations is, I think, critical too.
Yeah, I think that really is the key. Is the work we do today isn't for us; it's for people who aren't even here yet.
So you guys showed a database at one point that had 35, I believe, projects that were using the TAM in some way. If I'm working on a project related to a lake and it's implementing the TAM framework, is there a way that I can report that to you all, or is there a way that folks who might be working on a lake project might be able to collaborate with you in some way? Or how would you best like to interact with folks who are using the framework?
I think there's a couple different ways to do this. I mean, if you're working on a project that directly involves a tribal community and want to invite that tribal community into your project, I mean, obviously the earlier the better. If they're interested in working with you and want to host a workshop, our TAM author team is available for that. You can contact me, particularly through the Glyphwick website. My contact information is there. I'm currently kind of the de facto person that brings that stuff to the TAM team. Working through NIACS and their website, so forestadaptation.org, I believe it is. That is where the database was that I had up on the screen too, with the different TAM projects. And those projects are integrated in with all the other demonstration projects that they've done over the years. So there's a fairly substantial amount of work out there already that's been done using these menus.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Let's see, we've got a couple more questions. It's 3 o'clock. So these will be our last 2 questions, and then we'll finish up. How do you see this fitting into the 2-eyed seeing framework for Indigenous and Western knowledge systems proposed by Reed et al., if you're familiar with that work?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was going to say I have not read that paper yet. So I'm not exactly sure what they're touching on.
And I'm not as familiar with it as I probably should be, but I think it's very similar because it's trying to meld kind of the 2 different perspectives into a way of looking at the world.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And I've added that to my own reading list. That question came from an anonymous attendee, but what I will do is I will try to find that a link to that reference as well, and I'll share that with all participants as we email out the link. I think Eric Elgin has beat me to it. Okay, and the last question is, person is interested in the process for communicating with relatives effectively. Is it usually done primarily verbally, or what other communication methods are used? What would you recommend to people?
So that's not something that we prescribe or recommend, really. The different Indigenous groups have different ways of doing things. The ones that we're familiar with, that just happened to be Ojibwe and Menominee. But the last thing I want to do as a non-tribal person and a tribal employee would be to make suggestions to people on how they should go about practicing a different culture.
Okay, thank you. I think that makes sense. Okay, well, we are 3 minutes over time. I want to be respectful of folks' time. Again, I want to say thank you to Matt, Sarah, and Rob. Really appreciate you guys sharing your information and your perspectives and all of the hard work that you guys have put into the framework, to the menu. So thank you. And we will be following up. You'll see an email from me with a link to the recording, as well as some of the documents that we've discussed here today, and the contact information for our presenters today as well, if you have follow-up questions for them. With that, I will say thank you to the presenters again, and thank you to those of you that are attending for your work on inland lakes, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye, y'all.